A number of years ago, there was a group of Christians in Iran who were arrested during a worship service. They were charged with the crime of drinking alcohol. You may be aware that in many Islamic countries, they're not allowed by law to drink alcohol. And what they were doing was observing communion. And they knew that was going to be illegal, but it was more important for them to remember Christ and to commune with Christ. And so they had this communion service and they were arrested and taken to prison. Now, we've argued over a lot of things about communion as the years have gone by, and this argument divided the Protestant Reformation and has divided many churches. We've argued about whether God is present, Christ is present somehow in communion, or if it's just a visual aid to help us remember the cross. We've argued about who can be the president, who can preside over communion. Does somebody have to be ordained officially in order to do that, or can anybody do it? Who is able to participate in communion? Is it an open communion where all are invited to the table, or must you be a member in good standing? And then how about the presentation? Must the bread be unleavened or not? You'd be surprised that in much of church history, regular loaf bread has been used rather than unleavened bread. And then who is able to provide it? Does it have to be, as in a lot of churches, an ordained deacon that passes the communion trays each week? I visited a church one time where all of the deacons had matching blazers with the insignia of the church as they passed out the trays. Or can anybody pass out communion trays? We've argued about all of those things, and you may have known some churches that divided over some of those issues. But you know, those Christians that gathered in Iran didn't have any of those issues in mind. They were simply focused on Christ and the need to remember Christ and to commune with Christ and to proclaim the Lord's death until He came. When you're putting your life on the line, then all of the little issues and nitpicky arguments simply aren't worth even mentioning. You're simply proclaiming your faith in God. We've been looking for the past several weeks at the topic of tested faith. We're looking at the General Epistles, that is the epistles of James, Peter, and John, that specifically are not specific. They're general epistles written to a wide range of churches, which we'll illustrate here in a moment. And in doing that, they spend a lot of time talking about what it is to live the faith in difficult circumstances. Well, this morning we're looking at 1 Peter, and Peter makes it plain that the people that he's writing to, the church that are going to read his letters, or the group of churches, are going to be going through some difficult times. They're about to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. In fact, this is brought up in every chapter in the book. In chapter 2, but if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. In chapter 3, but if you should suffer for what is right, they could expect to do just that. And then in chapter 4, don't be surprised at the fiery ordeal that is on you. And then he goes on to say that this is a way that we participate in the sufferings of Christ. We proclaim solidarity with Jesus, who suffered for us during those times when we go through suffering. So Peter is writing to a church on the cusp of difficult times. Their faith is going to be tested. And again, because of that, we can expect him not to deal with a lot of trivial things. He's going to deal with things that are right at the center of what our faith is. So what is he going to stress? What is it that shows that we are having our faith tested and we are passing the test? Interestingly enough, what we're going to see Peter stress more than anything else in his book is living holy lives before the world that is against your faith. We are called to be holy, and because God is holy, we are to be holy as well. He begins the book like this: Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to God's elect, exiles scattered through the provinces of Pontia, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. Okay, that's just the way he addresses the book. It's from Peter, we got that, and he's writing to God's elect. He's writing to the chosen of God, the church. But notice how he describes them. First of all, he describes them as exiles, or foreigners, or resident aliens, or strangers in the world, depending on the translation in English that you have to be looking at. All of those words, these are people, you're not from around here. Your citizenship is, first of all, in heaven, and therefore you're going to seem like you're going to feel like a stranger in your own world. But not only are they exiles, they are scattered. They are the diaspora, a word that has been applied to the Jews that are scattered among pagans. Well, these are Christians who are scattered among the people of Pontus and Galatia and Cappadocia and all the rest. So you're living among people that are different from you, and because you are committed to God, you feel like a stranger in your own world. This past week, you may have heard, the Supreme Court handed down a decision, although the one that I'm going to be talking about was one that was on Tuesday, so it's kind of been overshadowed by the one that was announced Friday. This particular decision has to do with religious liberty. Maine is the most rural state in the Union. That doesn't mean it has the sparsest population, but a great deal of its population live in rural counties that are so sparse in population that they don't have school systems of their own, at least secondary schools. And so what the state of Maine does, it gives vouchers to parents so they can send their kids to private schools or even to public schools 3 or 4 counties over. But according to the state of Maine, you couldn't use those vouchers to go to a parochial school, a religiously affiliated school. Well, the Supreme Court overturned that law. They said that that's discriminating against religion, that if your school meets the criteria of the state of Maine, whether it's a faith-based school or not, then those vouchers have to apply. Now, the reason I bring that up is because that's like 15 Supreme Court decisions in a row that defend religious liberty and freedom. That there's a long stream of decisions over the last 20 years that uphold our religious rights and freedoms. In fact, David French, on his podcast this past week, says there has never been a people in the history of the world that have their religious freedoms as protected and rock solidly as we do in America right now. So, where do we get the idea that our religious liberties are in danger? Because we hear that a lot, right? That our religious liberties are in danger. Well, because that sells tickets better. That raises money better, and that gets political people involved more if you sell that narrative. Our religious freedoms are protected, but it is not easy to be a Christian today. Because while our religious freedoms are protected by law, the culture that we live in is not friendly to our faith. We live in a culture where our ideas, our ideals, mores, assumptions, values are anything but in keeping with what God says in His Word. And if we are going to maintain those values, those ideals, and those goals and values that God calls us to, then we're going to stand out as different from the world. We are exiles, strangers, resident aliens in a world that is not our own. And Peter is going to kind of develop that idea as he begins his book. And what I want us to do is just very quickly step through the opening section of his book, starting with verse 13 of chapter 1. First of all, he says that focusing on Christ in the world that you live in is going to be difficult. So he says, therefore, with minds that are alert, fully sober, set your hope on the grace that has been brought to you when Jesus Christ is revealed in His coming. So if you're going to focus on Christ, you're going to have to do it intentionally. You're going to have to focus. You're going to have to grit your teeth and set your mind on the grace that is calling you, because that belief is out of grace with the world that you live in. It's going to be difficult, and you're going to have to work at it. Focusing on Christ in a world that doesn't accept Him is going to be hard. Secondly, he says, and there's going to be pressure to conform. So he says, as obedient children, do not conform to the evil desires you had when you lived in ignorance. You see, this world that doesn't agree with your belief in Christ and does not see the glory of God and the salvation to come, as he talks about, is going to want you to conform to it. It's going to want you to fit in. In fact, he's going to say a little bit later, some of your former companions are going to think it's strange that you're not running with them to the levels of excess that they are. You're going to look different. It's going to be hard because the world is going to want you to conform. There's an old saying that says, the nail that sticks up is the one that gets pounded. And the person that's different is the one that sometimes is victimized by the world around. So you're going to have to be obedient, and you're going to have to resist this temptation to fit in and to conform. And our goal, our standard that calls us there is the glory and the holiness of God himself. So Peter goes on to quote from Leviticus and the Holiness Code. He says, but just as he who called you is holy, so be holy in all you do, for it is written, be holy, for I am holy. There's a whole section in Leviticus that gives different laws, and some of those are kind of, strange and ceremonial laws. Some of them are more moral and easier for us to see the big point. But God will give all of those. You are to do this. And then he adds, for I am the Lord. You shall do that, for I am the Lord. The reason we are called to live this holy life is that we are to reflect the holiness and the goodness of God. He is our standard, and therefore we have to be holy in everything that we do, because the God that we serve, the God that we've assembled together this morning to worship, is a holy God, and we must reflect that holiness. When I was a kid, the last rule of Court of Appeal, when Dad would tell me something that I didn't want to do, which he always did. He never told me to do something I wanted to do. So he'd tell me something, and I would go, why? And his stock answer was, because I said so. And the implication there is, I brought you into the world and I can take you out. He didn't really say that, but that was in the tone of voice, Well, see, the Court of Appeals for us, the why, when we ask, God says, because I am your God, and I'm holy. And because I'm holy, you have to be holy in all that you do. And then he goes on to say in verse 17 that we have to remember who we are then. We always, because we have to set our minds on being obedient, and we have to remember that God is a holy God, then we have to remember that at all times. Since you call on a Father who judges each person's work impartially, live out your time here as foreigners here in reverent fear. We are, again, he comes back to this idea of being resident aliens or foreigners in a strange country. Because the God that we serve is not accepted by the people around us, then we have to set our hearts and set our minds on being obedient to that Father, knowing that he is the one that's going to judge us, and we need to live our lives in the reverent fear of God as foreigners and strangers in a world that's not our own. When you're a foreigner who moves to a totally different culture, a totally different world, you've got really two basic choices. And I'm sure there are kind of variants between these two, but there's two basic choices. One is, some foreigners choose to adopt the culture they move into. So they want to fit in as well as they can. So they're very careful to learn the language. They adopt the dress and they eat the food. They try to fit in and be indistinguishable from other citizens of that country because it's easier to fit in. Let's just be honest for a second. We appreciate when somebody moves to our country and they try to adopt our culture. It's easier for us to get along with them if they act like us, right? We'll accept anybody as long as they act just like us. But see, some foreigners don't do that. They adapt to the culture. They get along in the culture. They do their work. They interact with people. But they steadfastly maintain the hyphen. They may be Americans, but they're Latinx Americans, or they are Asian Americans, or whatever culture you're talking about. They eat their food. They even speak their language, perhaps only at home. They maintain their identity, and that makes them a little strange, a little different from everybody, because they do maintain their identity. I heard a Latino a comedian, Paul Hernandez, I can't think of his name, Rodriguez, I think, used this illustration. He said, Anglos get so nervous when Hispanics speak Spanish around them. He said, because you're paranoid. You think we're talking about you. And he says, well, we usually are, but still, I can't imagine why people get upset because he speaks Spanish. But then one day he understood. He got into an elevator, and as he was going up, a Cambodian family got into the elevator with him, and they're speaking in their language. And the longer that elevator ride took, the madder that he got. And so finally, he hit the stop button on the elevator, and he turned around to the family and said, listen, you're in America now. Speak Spanish. We do have to admit that it is difficult when you stand out as different. And as the world around us gets more and more secular in its mores and ideals, affirming faith in Christ, and particularly living that life of holiness, can get uncomfortable. And so it's a lot easier for us just to fit in and speak the language of the culture around us. But Peter says, finally, you can't do that because you're bought and paid for. You have to live for God because God bought you with the blood of his Son. So he says in verse 18, for you know it was not with perishable things such as silver or gold that you redeemed from the empty way of life handed down to you from your ancestors, but with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without blemish or defect. So you have been bought by the blood of Christ, and because of that, you have to live a life that is holy and different, even if it causes you to stand out in the world that you live in. When I was a kid, Foursquare was the game to play on the playground. We used to run to try to get to the squares first during recess because that was the game everybody wanted to play. If you're not familiar with Foursquare, it's a court lined out with four squares, as you see, and you're supposed to let the ball bounce one time in your square, then hit it to another square. If you hit it out of bounds, or if you miss the shot, then you have to go to the end of the line, and everybody shifts in the squares. And the goal is to be number one square, because the guy in number one square gets to call the ground rules. There can be special rules. And so the guy in square one may say, no slams, spinners, corners, babies, or backstops. That means you can't put a spin on the ball. You have just to hit it straight. You can't do a backstop where you stop the ball, let it bounce, and then hit it. You can't slam the ball and make it bounce too high, and you can't cut the corner so that it's too hard to get to. You just kind of pattern the ball. And so you want to be in square one so you get to call the shots. I'm afraid that's how the church has always approached holiness. We've seen holiness as basically a list of rules that changes from church to church and place to place and time to time. But basically you're seen as holy if you comply with the rules. So the church may say, okay, no slams, no, they would say, no dancing, drinking, smoking, unless you're a deacon. I don't know why that was. But it seemed like the church I grew up in, if you were a deacon, you could go out and smoke between Sunday school and church. No watching certain movies, no having cable TV, no playing cards. I talked to a member one time who grew up in a church that had the rule that you could not play cards unless it was rook. If you played rook, that was okay. And so immediately all of the teenagers taught themselves how to play poker with rook cards. We'll show them, sort of thing. But it's your ability to follow the rules that are sort of made up and arbitrary. And that's how you are holy. And chances are, if you grew up in the church, you grew up with a list of things that you weren't allowed to do. I remember hearing sermons when I was a kid on the sin of mixed bathing. In case you're not initiated, mixed bathing means going swimming with members of the opposite sex. And that was considered to be unholy. So I would hear a sermon on why mixed bathing was a sin, and then I could talk about it with my church friends the next day at the pool. Because everybody was a member of the pool, even though the official thing was you can't go mixed swimming. We knew that was something that really didn't make a lot of sense. And that's the way a lot of the rules that determine whether or not we are holy. Now, we grew up enough to realize that list of arbitrary rules didn't really have anything to do with holiness. We realized a lot of the things that were on the list weren't sinful in them of themselves, that really the things are being hit at by a lot of the things on the list of what's in your heart, and the external list didn't have anything to do with what was going on in your heart. We realized that, sometimes it's really hard to draw the line between something that's okay and something that is not. And so in our wisdom and our maturity, we just stopped drawing lines altogether. We sort of decided that external acts don't really have anything to do with our holiness, and we're pretty much free to act just like the world around us. We watch the same movies, we go to the same places, we drink the same beverages, and we act just like the world in most ways. Those kinds of things don't matter. Well, we can disagree over some things that may or may not be holy. But we have to be absolutely certain that whatever we see reflecting the holiness of God, that's got to be who I am. That's got to be who we are. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, and self-control. If we are not seeking to live those things in our lives, then we have forgotten who it is that has called us. If we simply feel comfortable around the world, being just like the world, talking just like the world, acting just like the world, see, the problem with that is that denies who it is that we are called to be. Peter goes on to say a little bit later in his book, dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles, that idea of being not from around here, not speaking the same language, not having the same customs, you're a stranger in your own land, to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. He's not so interested in external acts as he is the internal desires that war against us. Because James told us, remember, that it is from our those desires that we act. And we war and have anger and treat each other poorly because of our lust within us. So you got to do war against those sinful desires which war against your soul. And then he said that translates to how we live on the outside, because he says, live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see the good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. You see his point? There's got to be something different, something otherworldly, something holy about the way that we conduct ourselves around people that aren't part of God's family. Not that we're preachy, not that we're always picking fights. In fact, that's the opposite of what Peter expects us to be. Later on, Peter is going to say, be ready to answer everyone that asks the reason for the hope that you have. In other words, he assumes that if you're living a holy life, if you're living to show the glory and holiness of God, eventually somebody's going to notice. You won't have to preach to them. They'll ask of you, and then be ready to give an answer. If we're living the kind of life that we're supposed to be living, if we're presenting the kind of holiness to the world that we're supposed to be presenting, then we become the ambassadors of Jesus Christ, and we have an opportunity to witness to the world around us. If we're just like the world around us, we don't even have a message for them, let alone being ambassadors for anything. Years ago, when the girls were much, much, much younger, one of them had a particularly bad breakup. And it was so bad, this will tell you how bad it was. Not only did she call her mama, she called her daddy for advice. That's how desperate she was to hear something that was helpful. And so we were talking long distance, and I was doing more listening than anything else, and said a few things. And then I told her, listen, living well is the best revenge. In other words, you go about your life, you go back to being happy and carefree and involved in your friends and involved in all the things going on in school, and you just enjoy yourself, and you being happy and living your life well, that's going to have the best message you can send to that no good so-and-so that dumped you. Now, that's really George Herbert who said that back in the 1700s. I might have let her think that her daddy came up with that on his own. And she's referenced it several times after that. Boy, you sure were right when you said that. Yeah, I was, honey. I really was. But see, that's what God is telling us about the way that we live our lives, not holier than thou. That doesn't communicate the right message. But living by the standards that God has called us to, so that the world sees that there is something about us that's different. And they're drawn to the message about Christ. We can know that if we live a life that is just as ungodly as the world around us, we're never going to be asked the question about God. And it is only by living this life of a standard that seeks God. Peter is going to tell us in his second epistle that we become partakers of the divine nature. That you and I can become mature enough where we reflect the very divine nature of God. And people will see that, and they're drawn to the message that we might have. But that only works if the King of our heart is always setting the standards and we're listening to his call. Are we going to allow the King of our heart to continue to speak to us and call us to holiness? As we sing this last song, we invite you, if there's something that you need prayers for, if there's something you need to unburden yourself about, some of our elders will be at the back of the building. Go ahead and go back and talk with them. Maybe they can go to a room with you, one of our meeting rooms, and pray with you right now. Or if there's just something that you need to unburden yourself about, they'll be back there. Also, if you need to dedicate your life to Jesus, to confess your faith in him and be baptized, that invitation is open too. If you'll go back to the back and tell one of the elders how they can help you. But let's commit today to allow the King of our heart, the King of our life, to truly be the King all the time.